In some cases, we need to be very selective when working with color. If the tools examined so far struggle to achieve the desired result, we have another weapon at our disposal: masks. Before proceeding, I would like to point out one detail. Adjusting colors using the wheel is easy, because the color areas are very well defined. Above all, they are similar in size. If you compare the green area with the others, for example, you will see that the angle is more or less the same. This does not correspond to what you usually see. In the spectrum, for example, the angle subtended by the green area is much wider than that dedicated to orange. The same is reflected in the wheels used in many software programs. The reason is that MTC ChromaWarp uses Eaton's color wheel, which has a particular arrangement of colors and is very easy to use. That said, let's try to intervene on a specific green, for example, this one. Using the usual procedure, let's select it as the input color. The radius moves to the position corresponding to the hue and saturation of the color we have chosen. Let's act on the H slider and move this color towards its complementary color, thus causing an extremely visible change. This change, without specific anchor points, also affects other color areas whose hue is the same but which differ in saturation and brightness. If we needed to limit this intervention precisely, how could we do so? The answer lies in the panel accessible by clicking on the last button, called Mask. When the panel opens, it reveals several sliders. The values you read are relative to the ray selected when the panel was opened, which in this case is green. We can identify it by the ray number itself, but also by observing the position of the two sliders in the field called Hue, which define the extremes of the adjustment range. Before moving then to see what happens, activate the function called Enable Qualifier by checking the box at the bottom. The first thing we can do is move the sliders to see how they behave. When we click on a slider, a function is activated that turns anything outside the range of action gray. We can also intervene with precision using the numeric boxes with the appropriate buttons or by typing in a number, and we can decide how sharp or blurred the edges of the intervention area should be using the slider called Soft. The lower the value, the sharper the transition will be, and vice versa. A sharp transition is very useful in this case, because it allows us to clearly see the impact on the two gradients below. The second is characterized by lower saturation than the one above, while the third has the same saturation as the first, but lower brightness. Unlike Photoshop's hue saturation adjustment, as we saw in a previous video, MTC ChromaWarp allows us to limit the effect based on saturation and brightness, which, in this specific case, is called value. In the case of a second gradient, whose saturation is lower than that of the first, we can click on the left slider. Almost the entire image is covered in gray, and the parts that remain visible indicate the areas to which the adjustment is applied. If we drag the slider to the right, at a certain point the green area visible in the second gradient disappears, because we have exceeded its saturation threshold. If we release the slider, we see that, unlike before, the pink area is no longer there. If we go back below the threshold, it reappears. The soft parameter, here too, adjusts the smoothness of the transition. In the third gradient, however, the effect is still visible because its saturation is above the threshold we have set. We must be careful not to overdo it, because if we raise the threshold too high, all areas will be excluded from the effect of the adjustment. Of course, we also have a slider on the right, which allows us to exclude areas with higher saturation. If we drag it to the left, the adjustment will not affect the first and third gradients, but will continue to be active in the second. If we return to the previous situation and exclude the effect of MTC ChromaWarp in the second gradient, the first and third continue to be affected by the effect because their saturation is the same. However, the third is characterized by lower brightness, and we can exclude it by intervening in a completely analogous manner on the third control value, moving the left slider to the right and thus excluding the darker areas from the effect. Here too, the soft parameter works in exactly the same way. As we can see, we have confined the effect of the adjustment to the top gradient. This demonstrates how selective the plugin is when we use masks. To sum up, the hue slider delimits the area of action based on hue and is certainly the most important. The two saturation and value sliders allow us to narrow the effect based on the saturation and brightness of the colors in the image, and this is sometimes the only way to achieve perfect results without having to create complicated masks by hand. Two more small things. The default values of the panel can be quickly restored by clicking on Reset. Then, to exit mask mode, simply click on this button. This will bring up the main panel again. Let's apply this powerful feature to a photograph that requires it.